Okay, so welcome back to part 3 of the color grading tutorial. So let's move on with our additional actual coloring tools. We talked a lot about luminosity before, but now let's talk more about the tools that we can use to adjust color. I think the most basic one you can use is a solid color adjustment layer. So let's start with that. Basically, if we want to inject a particular color into our image, we can just do that by selecting solid color. So obviously that is not looking great. We don't want that. When we have a solid color layer, we have to actually combine it with some sort of a blending mode. Let's start off, you can really pick any starting color you want. That's the whole, beauty of this, is that we can just keep adjusting the color until we find something we like. I'm going to start off with this sort of orangey tone. Let's say we want to try and get it back to something along the lines of our original warmer sunset feel. Typically when I use these solid color layers, I tend to use them fairly saturated. If you start off kind of over here, it really doesn't make sense because you're just going to have a completely desaturated image, and so you're not coloring, you're basically adding a neutral tone to it, which you don't want, as this is completely desaturated. So I tend to start fairly saturated, and then we'll kind of adjust from there. I always end up somewhere on this very edge because, of course, this is the most saturated. And then we're going to use the appropriate luminosity in combination with the appropriate blending mode. I'm going to start off right in the middle. Basically, if we start off at 127, that's essentially a halfway point. That's, the middle level. And the reason I want to start there is because I want to start with these screen overlay kind of blending modes, which typically operate from a neutral basis onwards. So anything that is lighter than neutral tends to get brightened, and anything that is darker than neutral tends to get darkened. So if we start neutral, then really what we're doing is we're kind of just injecting the color itself and not really playing around with the luminosities too much. So if we click OK there, and then we change our blending mode to something like soft light, we can see that this is where we're at. We've really warmed up this image. Similarly, we can go with overlay. That's going to be even more intense. I would just kind of stick to soft light because there's really no reason to go too crazy, because ultimately we're going to adjust our opacity down because this is probably not the look we want. Now, of course, we can keep playing around with hue as well here if we want to adjust just exactly, what that hue that we're injecting is. Maybe something like this ends up being a little more pleasing to us. Perhaps we're finding the other one had a little too much red. That's fine too. Let's just leave it at the default that we had there. Now, ultimately, I'm going to adjust the opacity down because to me this just feels like too much. So let's go to something like, around, let's say 35% or so. Toggling that on and off, we can see that we've warmed the image back up, and that gets us a little bit closer to something like this. Now, obviously, this, let's take off that adjustment. It's still different. In fact, I don't really like this color as it is. We would have to adjust that. But if we kind of go back to here, we're getting back to that more sunset kind of feel with a little bit more mood to it than just sort of this base layer here. And that actually, I think, looks pretty good. So if we're in soft light, we can see that the overall tone is fairly pleasing. Like, we haven't completely covered up our colors. It just kind of injects a little bit of that color across the image, which I think it looks really good. Now, if we go into color, what you'll see is that we are really colorizing the existing tones. I tend not to use color because unless you use it at a very low opacity, it just kind of takes away some of the original colors that are in there. Whereas with something like soft light, we've injected that orangey kind of color, but we still preserved a lot of the originals in there. As you can see, the red lip still is uniquely red and it stands out as being red. Whereas if I cover this up, everything kind of just takes on a really strong color cast, and it's almost like a duotone kind of image. And so we don't really want that. To me, soft light is a good way to kind of inject this color. Now, if we go to something like screen, that's obviously going to brighten our image a lot. It's still going to kind of retain the original colors, but it's going to brighten it a lot. And we may not want that, especially if we worked over here to make it a little moodier. Now, if we want to use screen blend mode, we can still do that, but what we have to do is adjust the luminosity of the solid color itself. So if we crank this way down, we can see that we're still injecting some of that color, but not kind of to the same extent. So obviously, either way, we're going to lose some contrast here, and we're going to brighten up the image, because as soon as you use screen, unless you're injecting pure black, in which case it will do nothing, anything that is brighter than black is going to brighten the image. So you're always going to be taking contrast out. Now, in the context of this image, that's probably not the best thing, but if you have an image where you don't want a lot of contrast, you want that more kind of lo-fi kind of feel to it, where it feels a little more vintagey, this can be a good way to go, because basically what you're doing is you're brightening up those blacks and you're injecting them with a little bit of this color, and at the same time you're reducing the contrast. So that may be something that you want. And that's not to say that this looks bad, but maybe this is just not what we're going for in this particular image. We want that mood, that contrast. Experiment and see what it is that you want from your image. But I think just with those 2 adjustment layers, you can see how far you can go with something as simple as a solid color and choosing the right blending mode, and what a difference that actually makes. We can also use something like multiply blending mode, obviously not like this, so we'll have to make a couple of adjustments here. We would first probably knock down the opacity, and then we're going to go in and actually change our color here. So if we kind of crank it up over here, what we're really doing is affecting the highlights, and we're kind of darkening them down a little bit, and obviously keeping in mind that we are actually clipping out the histogram here. So be mindful of that fact that you're not really extending the dynamic range, you're actually kind of squishing it doing this. So typically for me, I find with solid color, it's just nice to have this sort of middle level 127, and then actually choosing soft light or overlay. I think that looks really good. It's a very easy way to inject that particular color. And of course we can move this around. We can make the whole image cooler if we want. We can add a greenish cast, really wherever, sometimes magenta looks pretty good. And so really quickly we can kind of cycle through and see what looks good for this particular image. And generally speaking, I was down here because I'm still kind of hell-bent on this sunsetish kind of feel.